Welcome to week 6 of our Wholeness class. My name is Jesse Hauser, and I'm the City Center campus pastor at Crossroads Church. Today we're going to be talking about godly conflict, and there's 4 questions I want to focus on during our time together. What causes conflict? What does conflict mean about my relationship? What does godly conflict look like in a healthy, God-honoring relationship? And how do I create godly conflict in my relationships? So what causes conflict? There are many reasons for the disputes that we experience in life, but most of all is that we live in a world full of people who aren't us. This makes conflict unavoidable. They don't think like you, use the same language you do, handle emotions the way you do, or care about the things you do. And none of us is a shining example of perfection. We all have a sinful flesh, particularly when we're feeling emotional. It shows our ugliness. We know from studies completed about human psychology that unmet expectations produce negative emotion, which then leads to conflict. You expect that you'll be treated a certain way at work. You expect that your spouse will behave and care about you in a manner that you feel is appropriate. You consider this person your best friend, so you expect them to act in a manner that fits your idea of what constitutes a best friend. When these expectations aren't met, they produce a negative emotion, which can lead to conflict. So how do you handle conflict when it arises in your relationships, as it most certainly will? The first step is not to look at every encounter of conflict as a negative experience. There are certain elements of conflict that will be negative and produce negative emotion, but conflict also creates an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to correct ourselves where necessary. Conflict is also how you negotiate and define the boundaries and the direction of your relationship. It's also how you solve the irritating problems and the frustrations of being with someone who isn't an exact replica of you. In a relationship where there's no conflict, nothing's being decided. Your own thoughts that you wrestle with and through with yourself are conflict. It's how you make decisions. You have to make an opinion, and so does your partner, and there's no reason to assume that that opinion will or should be the same as yours. It's how you both work through and discover the truth while navigating your own biases. And throughout your entire relationship, you work to make sure your relationship is strong enough that it can withstand conflict when it arises. It's through the challenging issues of your relationship that you learn to negotiate with someone. It's how you learn to work and focus on someone other than yourself. It's how you bring about peace in your relationship by facing the problem that comes up in your relationship with and for one another and negotiating for the betterment of your life together. So we've talked about what causes conflict and how to understand the conflict in your relationship. Now let's focus on what godly conflict looks like. There are many areas of scripture that talk about how believers should conduct themselves. It's as if God knew that our lives would be full of conflict, and so he provided us with guidance on how to have conflict successfully. James 1:19-20 says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." If you're married or you've ever been in a relationship with another person, you know this to be true. All too often, when we're having a disagreement with someone, we don't listen to understand them, but to prepare our next point. We're slow to hear, and then we quickly speak to try and support our point and destroy theirs. Our default reaction when we enter into a disagreement with someone is to not give up any ground and to undercut the other person's argument as much as possible. This doesn't lead to conflict resolution, but more anger, which James tells us does not produce the righteousness of God. King Solomon, considered to be the wisest king to ever rule over Israel, wrote these words in Proverbs 15. "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a hard word stirs up anger." Likewise, in Proverbs 21, he says, "Whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble." So godly conflict works to respond softly, not harshly, and doing so will keep you out of trouble. This may feel like common sense, but how many times have each of us responded harshly and controlled our mouth, not only causing harm, but making a situation worse and getting ourselves into trouble? And there's a deeper reason why we should practice this approach. James actually talks about this very problem with controlling our tongue, beyond just keeping ourselves out of trouble. In James 3, he shares that while our tongue is small, it has immense power to steer our entire body. Just like the bit in a horse's mouth or the rudder of a ship, our tongue can control our entire body. He says our tongue is capable of an untold amount of unrighteousness, even so far as being set on fire by hell. So not just causing damage, but actually being an instrument of hell. And he explains that this is because the words we speak are a reflection of our heart. Hateful, bitter speech does not come out of a heart seeking peace and godly love for another person. We have to control the words we speak, not simply because it keeps us out of trouble, but because if not, we risk our tongue being an instrument of hell, not of heaven. Another key aspect of godly conflict is taking responsibility for yourself and the things that you've done. Continuing with the writing of James, he says in James 5, "Therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another, that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working." There's something powerful about taking responsibility for yourself and the ways that you've sinned. Not only is it humbling, But like James says here, it provides healing. Let's continue with the thought that you're having a dispute with your spouse, and you reach the point in the fight where it's showing no resolution. The conversation isn't going anywhere. So you break apart because the situation is going downhill and possibly fast. Go into a separate room and you think to yourself, probably I've done something stupid to contribute to this in some way. What might it have been? If you ask like you actually want the answer, you'll get the answer. You may not like it, and you most certainly won't want to admit it, and you may still feel like it's really only 5% your fault, but at least it's 5% that you can do something about and take responsibility for. Then you can go back to your spouse and say, here's the stupid thing I've done to contribute to this dispute that we're having. I'll try not to do it again, and I'm sorry that I've made this dumb decision. And maybe your spouse can do the same thing, and they can tell you the same thing. Now, maybe you're both humbled a bit in the proper manner, and you can actually have a discussion aimed at solving the problem instead of attaining victory over the other. This idea follows in line with the words of Jesus in Matthew 7. He says, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." We're also instructed in Scripture to maintain our composure in the midst of a disagreement. Possibly the most talked about verse when discussing anger is Ephesians 4:26, where Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger." There's some key parts to this verse that we should take note of. First, it's okay to be angry. Paul doesn't say that there's anything wrong with being angry. However, he does note that you must do so without sinning. So how do we do this? Well, following in line with everything else that we've discussed, we control our tongue and what we say, and we respond softly. Now, the second part of this verse is where people tend to disagree on what it means. There are typically two camps, one that believes that you cannot go to sleep until you've worked out the conflict. This was the camp I found myself in, but upon closer study of the verse, this isn't exactly what Paul says. He instructs the church not to let the sun go down on their anger. This doesn't mean that the conflict must be resolved before ending the day. However, it does mean that you must address your anger. Unaddressed anger can very easily turn into bitterness and resentment for the other person, especially if the issue is forgotten about and not addressed that day. This also puts the responsibility on you to address your anger. It doesn't indicate that it matters what the other person has done or why you're feeling so angry in the moment, but you must address your anger. So we've talked about what causes conflict in relationships, what conflict means about your relationship, and what godly conflict looks like in a relationship. Now let's talk about how we establish godly conflict. A fundamental thing to understand about people is that they want to feel heard. Carl Rogers, a psychotherapist, recommended that if you're arguing with someone, you allow them to have their say. They get the opportunity and the chance to state their feelings and the opinion on the situation. Then I say what you told me, but you have to agree that I got it right. And then the reverse. I get to have my say in the situation, and then you have to tell me what I said in a manner that I feel represents what I'm feeling. We don't have to agree with each other, that's not the point of this exercise, but you have to formulate my argument back to me in a manner that I agree with. So you're going to reduce it to what you feel are the most important points of what I'm saying. But it also prevents you from reducing my side of the argument to a straw man, because of course, I'm not going to agree with you if you do that. If you do this, the arguments tend to become more productive. You're at least listening to one another, and sometimes when you listen to someone and respond in an informed, productive manner, they discover the limits to their own arguments. They think, oh, I'm not really mad about this as I thought I was, or this isn't exactly what I meant, or maybe there's something else going on here that I don't understand. If you let them lay out their whole argument and you're quiet long enough to let them do that while they stumble around how they're feeling, then sometimes they stumble somewhere slightly more productive. You can learn a lot about someone if you're capable of being quiet. Another thing to understand is that people love to be rewarded and recognized for something they do well. You come home and the whole house has been clean, but there's hair on the bathroom counter where your husband shaves or your wife does her hair. You're not going to see the clean house, you're going to see the counter with the hair on it. And if your response is to ask them, well, why didn't you clean the counter? They're going to say, well, good luck getting me to clean the house ever again. The problem is that expectation stands out and what is done doesn't. You can just ignore what's done because it's done. It doesn't get in your way, and so it gets invisible very quickly. You've really got to watch for the tendency to only recognize when things aren't done and allow the things that are done to become invisible. One of the things that Friedrich Nietzsche said is that if you really want to punish someone, don't punish them for when they do something wrong. They're expecting that, and they might even be relieved by it. You want to punish them when they do something right, because then you're really going to hurt them. So for your relationship, that's something to really think about. If someone's doing something right, don't punish them for it. You do that 2 to 3 times and you're likely going to get them to not do that thing anymore. So practice judiciousness. If something happens that's good, if they do something good, notice it, reward it. And if they've done a bunch of things, don't focus on the things that they've done wrong. So we've already talked about if you're in the middle of a dispute with your spouse and it's not going anywhere, to separate. Think long and hard about how you've contributed to the situation, and then come back to each other and share what you've done to contribute to the current issue. But I want to stress that this is a great practice to incorporate into your relationship. It's humbling to admit that you're wrong and what you've done wrong, and it helps to disarm you and the other person. You focus less on the other person, you become less entrenched in winning and proving your own point, and you shift into seeking peace. You also need to practice fighting fairly with one another. As we've established, you're going to have disagreements in your relationship, so you need to negotiate and decide on how you're going to handle the conflict when it arises. Some good rules of thumb are to only discuss one topic at a time. It's easy for a disagreement to snowball out of control and into all the things that I feel that you're doing wrong. Pick the issue that you're going to discuss and focus only on that. Second, don't use degrading language. Not only is this not going to establish godly conflict, but it's very likely to do the exact opposite. No name calling, swearing, or putting each other down. You're likely to start attacking the other person's character when discussing them and not getting focused on the topic. 3, take turns speaking. Each of you will have things to share and no one likes to be interrupted. Make sure you're focusing on what the other person is saying and not just formulating your argument to counter their point as they're talking. Finally, I want to encourage you to fight for your relationship and for truth rather than trying to beat the other person. If you're married, you've both made a commitment to each other, your kids, but more importantly to God that we're going to stick this out until one of us dies. It's one of the few times in life where we're supposed to make a promise to God. If you're fighting to win at the other person's expense, you're not seeking godly righteousness or concerning yourself with the other person's soul. And if you're fighting to win, then the other person has to lose. No one enjoys losing. And it's not enjoyable living with a loser either. It's not worth the cost of winning. If you're married, and maybe you're young, you're going to be married for the next 40 years. That's almost 15,000 days that you're going to be with one another. It's likely convenient and easier not to have the disagreement about something your spouse is doing every day that bothers you. But that's a lot of days to continue to live with frustration. Maybe it's how your spouse greets you when you get home from work, or the acceptable level of cleanliness of the house, or how the dishes are loaded into the dishwasher. All of these may seem like trivial issues, and in some ways they are, but seen another way, they're not trivial at all, for 2 reasons. First, if something happens every day, it's important. Consequently, if there's something that is chronically bothersome, even in a minor sort of way, it needs to be attended to. Second, it's very common to allow so-called minor irritations, which aren't really minor if they happen constantly, to continue for years without comment or resolution. This is the problem. Collect 100 or 1,000 of those, and your life and marriage can feel miserable. So don't pretend to be happy with something if you're not, especially if a reasonable solution could be negotiated. Have the disagreement, even as unpleasant as it may be in the moment. It's one less straw on the camel's back of your marriage. And that's particularly true for those daily events that everyone is prone to regard as trivial, even saying hello when you arrive home from work or cleaning the dishes after dinner. Life is what repeats, and it's worth getting what repeats right. Every little problem you have every morning, afternoon, or evening with your spouse will be repeated for each of the nearly 15,000 days that make up a 40-year marriage. Every trivial but chronic disagreement about cooking, dishes, house cleaning, or responsibilities with finances will be repeated over and over unless you successfully address it. And these are also opportunities to practice and learn how to have healthy, godly conflict with one another. Better with the small things when there isn't a really challenging situation. Ask yourself and your spouse, what would a good relationship look like? If you could both precisely get what you wanted out of your marriage, what would it look like? And you have to think this through because the theory that my partner should know what I want and how to behave accordingly doesn't work. So you have to tell them what you want and how they could deliver it, and vice versa, all of which is awkward and uncomfortable to do. And you have to practice doing this, maybe for 6 months or more, because it takes a lot of practice to do something sophisticated really well, like having a satisfying relationship with someone other than you. But if you do that and you practice it successfully, you'll have a successful relationship for the rest of your life. So practice godly conflict, negotiate with each other in good faith for the betterment of your relationship. Fight for peace, seek truth, control your tongue, manage your anger, pursue godly righteousness in your relationship. And in doing so, establish godly conflict in your relationships.